사모의혹이 위성발사 성공 최백공일 2012년 12월 10일
청소리 울려라 청소리 울려 우리 쏠매 앞장서서 어서야 가자 청소리 울려라 청소리 울려 깊은 선물 가득 싣고 쏠매야 가자 힘든 사이로 쏠매야 가자 좋은 동 넘어 써야 가자 손에 손 잡고 노래 부르며 흥겨워서 우리 쏠매 잘도 달린다 청소리 울려라 청소리 울려 우리 쏠매 앞장서서 어서야 가자 청소리 울려라 청소리 울려 기쁜 선물 가득 싣고 쏠매야 가자 힘든 사이로 쏠매야 가자 좋은 동 넘어 써야 가자 손에 손 잡고 노래 부르며 흥겨워서 우리 쏠매 잘도 달린다 종소리 울려라 종소리 울려 우리 쏠매 앞장서서 어서야 가자 종소리 울려라 종소리 울려 기쁜 선물 가득 싣고 쏠매야 가자 쏠매야 가자
At this point, it's been about 48 hours. Our team is extremely tired, and we're waiting in Southeast Asia for the refugees. We heard from our partner that the refugees would be crossing the border early that morning.
The idea was that we would pick up the group of 5 refugees once they crossed the river. Our team parted with them right on the border of China, and we would meet back up with them to pick them up and take them to our shelter in Southeast Asia. We had about an 800-mile trek to the shelter from the pickup location.
The intensity with the team at this point was a mixture of exhaustion, excitement, frustration, but also nervousness. We haven't heard from the refugees at this point.
We received a call pretty late at night. We had just checked into a motel, and the call came to a surprise. They weren't supposed to be there that early, but we were told that the refugees were 60 miles away from the drop-off location, and also that the location had changed. I was very nervous because we were 90 miles away, and I was afraid that we wouldn't get there in time to rescue this group and to get them to our shelter. The second hour passed, and at this moment, at this time, I thought that we had failed. I thought that the refugees must have gotten picked up somewhere along the way from China to Southeast Asia. It was a really difficult situation to be in.
For over a decade, hundreds of thousands of North Koreans have escaped their country, and they've left behind their homes and their families. It's virtually impossible for them to cross into South Korea because the DMZ, or the Demilitarized Zone, which divides Korea at the 38th parallel, it's the most heavily fortified border in the world. Instead, they flee into neighboring China and are forced into hiding. This is because the Chinese authorities will seek them out and forcibly send them back to North Korea. If they're caught and sent back, they will face detention, imprisonment, torture, and even execution. Much as possible, we have to go black. Okay. I think we have to utilize the same systems that we were using before when it comes to the phones that we were using, and also making sure that we're not communicating through some of the more major channels. Obviously, we have to implement also the codes that we were using before, and so I think that access is going to be limited, and we'll have to do it through third party, but that we'll still need to get those check-ins, and we'll set the schedule for when we need to get those things. But in terms of once we get out of China, that's when it gets really tricky.
Months before the mission would take place, we decided that we would establish a team here in HQ that would help guide and then navigate us through the actual journey itself. And so we needed to create a pretty strict protocol that would allow us to stay in touch with HQ back in Los Angeles, and also to provide real-time updates so that if anything were to happen, the team back here would know where we were at and who was with us. And so we met for months about our security protocol to communicate where we would be when we were at different places or drop-off locations in cities in China. And we also created a through email that would allow us to securely communicate more openly if we needed to.
I served as a liaison to communicate messages between our partners and also our staff who were on the ground traveling with the refugees, especially at times when they weren't able to communicate directly to share vital information. It doesn't matter. You can't traverse illegally across these borders and then plan on flying out of China
we wouldn't
back out.
Well, we enter China legally because we already have our visas for that.
It was really important for us to document this trip for a number of reasons. The routes themselves, the experience, and how difficult and dangerous that journey is. And even the ability to follow along and to be alongside these refugees and to hear their stories and to hear their fears. I think that's one of the most powerful things that we could have captured. One that still so many people have not yet heard.
We decided to split up our team, send a couple of people to China early, and I decided to go to Korea to meet with our partner who is working to rescue refugees, and the plan was to meet with him to talk through our itinerary, to talk about the specific details of the mission. He said we could have a plan as we arrive to China, but things change instantaneously.
이건 기차 시간을 아직 정확히 모르겠고 도착하는 즉시로 우리가 막 같이 미팅하게 될 거야. 그리고 내일은 아침에 9시에 떠나가지고 9시 전에 떠나서.
North Korea emerged in 1945 when the U.S. and the Soviet Union divided the Korean Peninsula in half at the end of World War II to disarm the Japanese military. But Korea's, both North and South Korea, have a much deeper and rich history that goes back at least 1,200 years. In 668 AD, the Shilla dynasty unified the Korean Peninsula under one government. And since that time, the Korean Peninsula has been under one government and thought of itself as one country.
The Korean Peninsula is unified by the Shilla dynasty in 668 AD. During 12 centuries of independence, the Korean people develop a strong sense of identity, distinct from China and Japan. In 1910, Japan colonizes Korea, ending their independence. Korean nationalist groups arise, hoping to regain their independence. Some associate with Chinese and Soviet communists. Others hope to gain favor with Western nations like the United States. Kim Il-sung aligns with the Chinese communists and leads small guerrilla forces fighting the Japanese in the wilderness of Manchuria. Syngman Rhee goes to the U.S. 1945, end of World War II. Japan is defeated and their 36-year occupation of Korea ends. A rushed agreement is reached to fill the power vacuum. Soviet forces control the northern half of the peninsula, installing Communist Kim Il-sung as the leader, and U.S. forces control the southern half, installing anti-communist Syngman Rhee in the south, creating a de facto divide at the 38th parallel. Mistrust on both sides in the emergent Cold War prevents cooperation on countrywide elections that would keep Korea unified. August 15, 1948. Syngman Rhee declares the formation of the Republic of Korea in Seoul, claiming jurisdiction over all of Korea. 25 days later, Kim Il-sung declares the formation of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in Pyongyang, also claiming jurisdiction over all of Korea. June 25, 1950. Confident of a quick victory and driven by the desire to control all of Korea, Kim Il-sung, backed by Communist China and the Soviet Union, launches an attack on the South, and the Korean War begins. The U.S. intervenes, helping to push the North back. The war devastates the entire peninsula, tearing families apart and taking the lives of millions. July 27, 1953. An armistice is signed to end major hostilities. However, to this day, the Korean peninsula remains technically at war. The only separation between North and South is a 2.5-mile wide demilitarized zone, the most heavily fortified border in the world. Over the next few decades, both Koreas rebuild. North Korea's development is initially faster than the South. Massive effort is put into propaganda campaigns to create a personality cult around Kim Il-sung, their eternal president. Juche, the heart of North Korean ideology, ingrains the attitude of self-reliance in order to resist foreign invasion and guard against outside intervention. By the 1960s, the North provides medical care, universal education, food, and housing to the people. The South experiences periods of dictatorship, military coups, rapid economic development, and democratization, later emerging as one of the most successful democracies in Asia. Communism collapses in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Major sources of aid and trading partners for North Korea are eliminated. July 8, 1994. Kim Il-sung's death triggers intense national mourning. His son, Kim Jong-il, prepared for power decades in advance, replaces him as leader. Under Kim Jong-il's military-first policy, precious resources are diverted away from the North Korean people, and massive efforts go into developing nuclear weapons. Ensuring the security and survival of the regime continues to be the top priority.
North Korea is an extremely complex issue. It's not just a straightforward human rights issue. You have so many other things that are involved, like the security, nuclear, economic, and even humanitarian issues that are all inextricably linked.
It's even difficult to discuss this issue sometimes because it's so politically sensitive, and even refugees find it difficult to talk about because they're scared that if they are public, it may endanger the lives of their relatives back home in North Korea.
The torpedo that sunk the Cheonan and took the lives of 46 South Korean sailors was fired by a North Korean submarine.
The North Korean government today declared it's ready to wipe out the United States.
Right now, there's also new urgency around the world to respond to threats of another Korean war.
For the North Koreans' part, they see nuclear weapons as the ultimate security guarantee. They see it as fundamental to the survival of their regime, and for them it also gives them an extremely powerful bargaining chip that also enables them to sit down at the negotiating table with some of the most powerful countries in the world. So they really don't want to give that up. But too often the United States and other countries have really prioritized this issue over all other concerns. But with the growing recognition that North Korea will not give up their nuclear weapons, I think that this really underscores the need to take a more strategic approach and to put more emphasis on the suffering of the North Korean people.
The North Korean government systematically violates the human rights of its people. From what we know from defectors who have left North Korea and from information on the ground, it's extremely impoverished and is the most politically repressive regime that has ever existed in history. North Koreans don't enjoy many of the basic freedoms that we take for granted. Things like freedom of movement, speech, religion, even information.
The North Korea political system, as it's been built up over the last 50 years, really is like a stool with three legs. The first leg is control of information coming in the country or leaving the country. The second leg of the stool of the regime is surveillance of the citizenry. There are numbers of police forces and then also groups at work and groups in the neighborhood that constantly spy. They're overlapping, interarching surveillance systems that keep track of the citizenry, all of their moves and all of their statements. The third leg is sure and swift and severe punishment for what the regime considers to be infractions.
What the regime worries about is giving up too much control. This is a totalitarian government where they control or attempt to control every aspect of North Korean life.
To enforce that control, any dissenters are put into this network of political prison camps in North Korea. These camps range anywhere from re-education camps to brutal labor camps, and the conditions are horrific. North Korea utilizes a system of collective punishment, which means that if I commit a crime or a perceived crime, not only will I be punished, but up to 3 generations of my family will be punished.
So to achieve this, they've created a ruthlessly efficient system of political control that has zero tolerance to any form of political dissent, which creates this incredible atmospheric fear of any form of resistance or standing up against the regime.
Within this network of political prison camps, there are estimated to be approximately 6 different camps, with anywhere up to 200,000 inmates currently in the system. These camps still exist today. I mean, they've lasted twice as long as the Soviet gulags and 5 times longer than the Nazi concentration camps.
They deny that the prison camps exist. In December of 2009, the North Koreans gave a speech at the UN Human Rights Council in which they declared that the term political prison does not exist in the DPRK vocabulary. Their response is to turn and accuse the North Koreans who provide the information as liars and traitors to the country, and they denounce human rights criticism by other non-governmental organizations or by other countries as a political attack meant to overthrow the regime.
저는 이제 1982년 이제 11월 19일 날 그 수용소에서 태어나가지고 2005년 1월 2일 날 이제 처음으로 이제 캠프를 탈출하게 됐었습니다. 일단 수용소 안에 들어간다고 하게 되면은 뭐 제가 알기로는 이제 북한에서는 전제하지 않는 사람들로 알고 있거든요. 거기 들어온 사람들은 일체 신분증이라는 걸 모두 해소하고 늙어 죽을 때까지 그들의 전제를 북한에서는 이제 부정하고 있고요. 또 거기서 태어나는 어린이들 자체도 이제 태어났다고 해서 무슨 신분증이라든지 뭐 이런 태어난 출생 절차에 대해서 전혀 이루어지지 않고 있습니다. 또 다시 말씀드리지만 우리 북한에서 탈출한 사람들은 북한 정부에서 말하는 인간 쓰레기들이 아니고 또 인간 어머니들이 아니라는 것을 말씀드리고 싶습니다. 그들은 단지 그냥 배고픔에 못 익어서 또 억울하게 죽는 것이 두려워서 또 자유를 그리워하면서 탈출했을 뿐이지 북한 정부에서 말하는 그런 인간 쓰레기들이 아니고 인간 어물들이 아닙니다. 감사합니다.
Telling the story of North Korean refugees is difficult. When we were in China, there were physical challenges as well as making sure that the safety of the refugees was a priority. I was trying to find the best ways to shoot this documentary, to capture the stories, to tell the refugees' stories, and at the same time, the identity of the refugees had to be concealed as well as the locations where we were at, which was pretty difficult to work through.
Once our team met up in China, we packed up our bags and drove to the location where we would be meeting with all the refugees in one of our shelters, and then from there we would start the mission. During our first night in China, our partner took us to a shelter that was housing a refugee that had been hiding in China for 3 months. His name was Myung-soo, and he escaped North Korea due to the religious persecution that he underwent.
부모를 떠나서 정말 부모도 보고 싶고 동생들도 또 보고 싶었고 자유가 없는 것이 제일 힘든 신앙의 자유가 먼저 없고요. 그리고 또 사람들이 경제적으로도 자유가 없습니다. 자유가 많은 나라로 가고 싶습니다.
Another refugee that was joining our group was Min-sung. He was just out of North Korea. He escaped 3 days prior to us meeting him. And it was a really interesting meeting because he had never met a foreigner. He had never met a white person before, and his country taught him that we were his enemies, and that the reason why he was so hungry was because we were consuming all the food. And so for the first couple of hours, it was just breaking down those barriers and really trying to learn about each other.
그래서 제가 이렇게 여기로 오게 된 것은 거기가 너무 자유가 없고 조직적으로 너무 매아놓고 먹지도 못하고 입지도 못하니 그게 어떻게 사람이 한번 세상에 나서 한번 살 바에 좀 사람답게 살아보자고 여기 왔습니다. 그날은 진짜 힘들었습니다. 아침에 학교 갔다가 9일날 아침에 학교 갔다가 온 다음에 저녁에 집에서 나와가지고 물을 건넸는데 물 건널 때 물이 너무 불어서 죽을 뻔했습니다. 그래서 있는 힘을 다해 건너왔는데 조선 건너니까 조선족 중국 사람들이 이북에서 왔다니까 절 들여놓지도 않고 전화 좀 하자는데도 말 안 듣습니다. 그런데 내가 중국에서 넘어오니까니 또 도로부터 시작해서 집을 해놓고 사는 것부터 이북만 완전히 달랐습니다. 그 다음에 사람들이 이북의 사람들만 이렇게 자유가 그저 자기 자유니까 얼마 부럽던지 그것이 모르겠습니다. 부모님은 내 여기 온 거 모릅니다. 왜냐하면 내가 여기 오겠다고 했다고 말하면 어느 부모 제 자식이 죽으라고 그렇게 내놓을 부모가 어디 있습니까? 이제 저는 잡히게 되면 이북에 가서 들어가서 맞아 죽지 않으면 무기징역 가게 됩니다. 내가 탈출해서 대한민국에 간 거 알게 되면 부모 형제를 잡아서 이런 관리소에 그러니까 딱 닫힌 구역이라고 말하죠. 이렇게 자유도 없고 뭐 자기 외지에도 나가지 못하고 딱 그런 닫힌 구간에 그런 데 보냅니다. 저는 여기 오니까 아버지, 엄마, 누나, 할머니 생각이 너무 나서 잠도 제대로 잘 수 없습니다. 아버지, 엄마 사랑이라고 말할 땐 집에 먹을 것이 없을 때 자신께서 굶으시면서 저 입에 그저 죽물이라도 한 숟갈이라도 저 입에 더 떠넣어주고 그저 추울세라 더불세라 그저 날 그저 한 품에 하나 그저 이 나이 이렇게 먹도록 키워준 겁니다. 맛있는 음식을 먹어도 이북의 사람들 생각나서 부모님 생각들 나서 하나도 맛있는 건 모르겠습니다.
To see him so sad was really hard and was really eye-opening because we saw just again what this issue is doing. It's causing families to be separated, and it was just really hard to see and really hard to hear Min talk about his family in this way.
It's really the famine that's the big push that drives large numbers of refugees across the border into China. This was a famine, one of the great famines of the 20th century, killed between 600,000 and 1 million people by our estimates, about 3 to 5% of the population. After the famine of the 90s, the North Korean economy began a gradual recovery in the late 90s and early 2000s. But one of the things we found in the study of the famine was that the public distribution system that distributed food never really fully recovered. And what happened in North Korea at that time is really interesting because markets started to function as the state apparatus, the state distribution system broke down. And so individuals were increasingly dependent on the market to purchase food, and because they had to purchase food on the market, they had to earn income in order to purchase the food, which meant that they were then engaged in market activities to earn income. So this process we call marketization from below was triggered by the famine, but it's striking that it's persisted from the famine straight through to the present. Since the famine, North Korea really has been a chronically food shortage country. And it's during the peak years of the famine, 94, 95, 96, that people start to move around the country in search of food and also start moving across the border.
When North Koreans decide to actually try and escape the country, the most obvious place to go is China because it's easy to get across the border. The problem is once they cross the border into northern China, they have to immediately hide because China doesn't recognize them as political refugees.
North Koreans are in hiding because China will forcefully repatriate them if they are found. And as soon as a North Korean leaves North Korea, they are legally termed as refugees because they have a well-founded fear of persecution if they are sent back. And even though China is a signatory to the 1951 Convention on Refugees, under which they have obligations to protect refugees, they don't recognize the refugee status and they turn them as economic migrants so that they can send them back.
So why does the Chinese government do this? In large part, it's because the Chinese both have a very close although not warm, relationship with the North Korean government, and so doesn't define the people trying to leave for reasons of the political relationship between the two regimes. And it also doesn't because it doesn't want to actually encourage more refugees to come into China. So they have a lot of self-interested reasons why they don't want to have North Koreans come across the border. And so they prefer to just round them up, ship them back.
China has a very efficient system in place for finding North Korean refugees. They have secret police who roam around these areas in China looking for North Koreans who are in their country, and they also look for individuals who are helping North Koreans.
So we're getting ready to meet up with our broker that will be leading our refugees to Southeast Asia. We're meeting tonight to talk logistics about the journey. We leave at 3 p.m. tomorrow. Possibly a KTV, karaoke bar. We're looking for a private room so we can talk business. We got to be very discreet about it. So we're figuring it out right now.
The night before our mission, we decided to meet with our guide to talk through some of the details and logistics of the mission. We also wanted to ask if he would give us permission to film the entire journey out of China.
So we will 2点钟对吧？
基本就是不过什么意了。
就一直在这里走。
对，有空到就10个小时，他们就相差到底。对。
But the fact that the Chinese don't treat them as refugees has important implications for the vulnerability of the refugees in China, because it means basically that they're illegal migrants. And what we found in our surveys is that the refugees in China are subject to a lot of exploitation and abuse precisely as a result of the fact that they're there on an illegal basis.
You know, as North Koreans have fled into China, one of the main issues has become that a result of China's one-child policy is this lack of women. These North Korean women, as they've crossed over the border and gone into China, have become trafficked. I've sat down and have spoken to and met and heard the stories of so many of these women who have been trafficked. Some of them have been trafficked across the border, have been sold repeatedly. It's difficult to hear their stories, especially because many of these women are actually my age or even younger. And to hear what they've been through, first with the suffering in North Korea, to the challenges in the journey across the border, to being sold and then having to endure marriages to these men that are sometimes 30, 40 years older than them, to men who sometimes handcuff them or lock them inside because they've bought them and they don't want them to run away, or these women who've been beaten so badly. The list goes on in terms of the different stories that I've heard, and it's really one of those things where it's very clear that the North Korean people themselves have been the ones that have suffered the most as a consequence to this situation. They estimate that 70 to 90% of North Korean women that have fled into China end up being trafficked. They end up being forced into these marriages. They end up working in these karaoke bars, in these brothels, in these sex chatting industries. And the result has also been that they marry these men and have these kids that are half North Korean and half Chinese. And the Chinese government, they don't recognize them as being Chinese citizens, and so they really are not provided with even basic education or access to basic rights.
저 이름은 명희. 지금 25살이에요. 네. 고향에서 살다면 어릴 적에 학교도 못 다녔고요. 학교가 돈이가 그렇게 많지 않으니까 학교를 못 다녔죠. 아무것도 모르지. 네, 어머니는 심장병이 있다고요. 고혈압이죠. 병이 있는데다 아버지가 그렇게 건강하지 못하니까 그래서 난 여기 와서 어떻게 장사해서 아버지 어머니한테 보내드리라고 그렇게 이렇게 봤는데 네, 여기 와서 남편하고 살면서 여기 와서 한 달 후에 결혼했어요. 결혼해서 사는 건 저 20살이죠. 전번에 처음으로 날 때린 건 남편이 밤에 들어오지 않아서 그래서 내가 문을 걸었거든요. 문을 걸어서 들어오지 못하니까 창문을 넘어 들어와서 날 때린 거예요. 여기 와서 제일 슬픈 건 내 결혼한 지 반년, 6달 될까? 6달 만에 나 아무것도 모르는데 남편 일하러 갔다고요. 그래서 돈 벌러 간다면서. 돈 벌러 가서 나 어떻게 살아요? 그러나 난 말 못하죠. 말할 줄 모르니까 가면 가지. 가면 가자. 그때 알을 임신했고 있었거든요. 내 속에 무슨 일이 있는지 간 생각도 안 하죠. 내가 무슨 관심인지. 4달이죠. 3달 반. 네. 그렇게 생기고 말도 잘 들어요. 6달 만에 엄마랑 말 불렀어요. 야, 얼마나 기분 좋은지. 어떻게 해서나 잘 키우자면 저 무슨 말을 다 해도 저 돈이 있어야 되는 거예요. 그러나 이 집에는 돈이 없다고요. 이런 가지고 살까 말까 이런 상태라고요. 돈이 기준하죠. 누가 애기 엄마랑 또 그런 거예요. 누가 애기를 둬두고 밖에 나가서 일하면서 살겠어요. 모두 옆에 둬두고 애를 교양하고 키우고 싶죠. 그러나 난 그렇지 못해요. 일하러 가야 돼요. 돈이 없으면. 할아버지 할머니 말 잘 듣고 내가 올 때까지 기다리고 공부를 다 하라면 돼요. 건강하고 다른 말 없어요.
Making the decision to leave North Korea is a very difficult one for many of these individuals. They're leaving behind their homes and even their families, and oftentimes without even saying goodbye or letting anyone know that they're going. For many of them, they're separating from parents or siblings or even leaving behind children. It's very difficult to actually make the decision to go, which is why it shows how desperate I think many of these North Koreans are to actually leave. They're going into China looking for food, looking for medicine, money, and even freedom. In the early years of defection, most North Koreans were trying to get into foreign embassies where they could seek asylum. The result of this was North Korean refugees climbing embassy walls and rushing into the gates, and the Chinese government began to put a lot of pressure on these governments, essentially making it difficult for these refugees to find asylum any longer in the embassies. Instead, today, North Koreans are using what we call a modern-day underground railroad, which is approximately a 3,500-mile journey from China through Southeast Asia. In order to leave, they have to do so illegally. So through the help of missionaries and underground churches and NGOs, and sometimes even just brokers, North Koreans are paying their way out or finding individuals that will help them to safely make it through this extremely difficult journey. They cross through multiple borders illegally, through multiple countries, and eventually find safety in Southeast Asia, where they can then seek resettlement to a third nation.
For those of you going to South Korea, we'll make sure you get to the right place in order to get to South Korea. So I just want to talk to you guys about the journey. The first leg will be 18 hours. 2 other people from our team will meet up in Southeast Asia. We'll pick them up. We'll drive them to our shelter and explain the rest. I was really nervous the morning of the mission because I understood what was at risk. We had just spent 2 weeks with this group of refugees. We became really close. We shared stories. And as I thought about this escape out of China, I realized that this mission could very well go wrong, and that these refugees could be caught and sent back to North Korea. As we left and as we went to the bus park where we would meet with the guide and eventually start our 3,000-mile trek across China, we arrived early and we got onto the bus. And within the first 10 minutes, we thought that the mission was compromised. The bus stopped, it pulled over, and a police officer came onto the bus, and he was checking people's IDs. He was checking everyone on the bus. He got to me and he asked for identification, and so I gave him my passport, and he looked at it and he nodded his head, and then he turned around and walked away, and he didn't even acknowledge the fact that there were still a few people behind me, which were the refugees. And I don't know why he decided not to check their ID, but that really set the tone for the rest of the journey. We knew that we had to be on guard. We knew that at any point the mission could fail. Our bus broke down in a city. This caused a couple of problems. We were supposed to be in the south by the end of the day, and since our bus broke down, we knew that that wasn't going to be possible, which meant we weren't going to be able to meet up with the right guides to be smuggled out of China. So we immediately hired a private car to try to catch one of the buses that was en route. The night before, it rained really hard in China, and so many of the roads were flooded and covered and were closed. We ultimately had to get out of the car. We had to run up the side of this mountain, which led us to the freeway where we would jump in front of the bus. Once we got to the south, we met up with the new guides that would lead us the rest of the way. So we're at the second drop-off location, getting ready to hand off the refugees to the next guide. As we met up with Su Young, we discussed with her about her options, told her that she had options of resettlement in the U.S. or South Korea or elsewhere, and she informed us that she wanted to go to South Korea because she had family there. That's where Ryan and I parted with the group. We were going to be responsible for leading them through the last 800 miles in Southeast Asia.
Much of the information and insight that we have about North Korea today has come from these individuals that have escaped from that country. And the stories of the North Korean refugees has raised a lot of awareness about the issue. They also provide a bridge back into North Korea because many of them stay in contact with their families and they send information and money back to their family members, which enables them to buy human security and to survive in the country and also to learn some things about the outside world.
For us, helping North Koreans where they can be reached is a very important part of our mission. These individuals will play a larger strategic role in the solution that we're pursuing to end this crisis.
Obviously, dealing with North Korea is very complicated, and it's going to involve action on a lot of different levels. But I think that the activities of groups like LINK and other human rights organizations are critically important in trying to operate underneath the radar by getting people into North Korea and getting people out of North Korea, expanding the flow of information, and opening up an opportunity for people to leave. Because by encouraging the exit of North Koreans, either permanently or those who return, we're either contributing to opening the country or we're providing new information back into North Korea on circumstances on the outside. And obviously it becomes harder for an authoritarian regime to maintain itself as the citizens are more informed about opportunities abroad. The whole process of opening the country is not something that's going to happen only at the diplomatic level. It's something that happens through NGOs and other groups, churches, whomever that is willing to help fight this battle.
We also see North Korea changing. Over the past 10 years, with the introduction of the markets, information in and out of the country, and the introduction of new technologies, it all points to increasing opportunities to influence the future of North Korea.
Information is moving into North Korea through several different channels. One is through the market itself, as cultural product is bought and sold, DVDs, tapes, cassettes, that type of thing.
North Korea today is more open than ever before. And the proper comparison isn't how open they are compared to like the United States or even a China. Because by that measure, they're not open at all. One of the reasons the government's very hesitant to open up and reform too much is you might get people thinking for themselves, organizing, and then protesting, as they did in Libya. It's one of the reasons they go back and forth. At the same time, that's probably what we would expect to see. And that's the same reason we expect to see it as the reason the North Korean government is not doing it, right? Is that they expect that the people are going to protest. Right now, we don't expect bottom-up protest because they're not organized enough, they're not powerful enough. Over time, if they open up, they could. And that's actually one of the reasons that we try and get information in there. Like, here's what the outside world's about. Your life can be better in a different way.
As our team arrived in Southeast Asia 2 days prior to the pickup, we scouted out the pickup location, and we finally got the call about 2 days in. And we were exhausted because we hadn't slept. We were anxious for the call. And as we drove to the pickup location, we realized that it was wrong. It wasn't the area that the refugees were dropped off in.
She said they're flying right now.
There's a couple people up here, but they moved. So what did she say?
She's just scared. She's like, please hurry. They're dogs. They're scared.
We got this call and the team couldn't find the refugees. We were so scared. We felt so helpless because there was really little that we could do except continue to just look for them in the areas that we thought that they were supposed to be.
After hours and hours of driving up and down the river, searching for the refugees, looking for them, we decided to honk the horn and ask them if they could hear it, since they had a phone that we had given them prior to leaving China. So we would honk the horn and we would ask the refugees, do you hear it? Do you hear it? And often they said, no, we hear nothing.
We can't do that anymore. Yeah, we're kind of waking up the neighborhood.
For us here, it was extremely nerve-wracking to just wait on edge to get those updates until we knew that they were found.
As we were driving back, as we were heading back to the hotel, we noticed a road that we hadn't tried yet. We drove a few miles down, and as we drove, we honked the horn, and the refugees heard it. They told us that they heard the horn. And so they came up to the road, and we saw two refugees in the headlights. We saw them come up to the road, and we were ecstatic. We were so excited. It was the best feeling to see these refugees and to realize that it wasn't a failure. They came up to the car and they told us that the refugees were close, and so I drove them to where they told us to drive, and Ryan and our partner decided that they would walk, and we didn't realize how far they actually were. And so at this point we lost our camera. We couldn't record what had happened. But I remember running down to the water with the two refugees, and we ran for about a half a mile. I was shocked to see the group hiding in a bush that was on the river, to see Myung-soo with his shirt off and his wrapped around Soo-young's baby. It was just a crazy experience. But as we found them, we brought them back to the car, and we took them to a hotel so that they could clean up. Ultimately, the goal was to get them back to our shelter in Southeast Asia where we could begin their processing. And it was a 15-hour drive. We had to go through several security checkpoints. And once we made it to our shelter, the refugees were free.